After having worked on plenty of small engines in my short career, there have been a few items that I haven't had the pleasure of working on, and when my coworker asked me to look at their Echo blower, I really didn't think too much about it. That was until I saw it. This vintage Echo blower was something I'd only seen in pictures online, but I'd never seen in person until now. Whatever happens, I need to get this blower working again, that way I can mark it off my list of things I haven't worked on. In today's video, we're going to look at this vintage Echo backpack blower, and the problem is that it's been sitting for a very long time and it won't start. The worst part was that I had to figure that out after having worked on it already. When they gave it to me, they didn't have any information about it, but to be honest, I'd rather prefer it that way because most of the time the information they give me is typically wrong or partially right, and it only serves to confuse me, at least until I do my diagnostic. Now, I'm going to try and repair this leaf blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. After taking a good look around, there are a few issues here and there that will need to be looked at. Most are not critical to how the blower works, but they do affect on how easy it is to use. But for the most part, this blower is in pretty good shape considering its age. Now, just because leaf blowers typically have a very tough life and because of its age, the first thing I want to do is to perform a compression test. This will measure how much pressure the engine can make on the compression stroke. To use it, just remove the spark plug and screw in the tester in its place and then pull the rope several times. Now, the more pressure it makes, the better. But if the reading is low, the engine might not start at all. If you need one of these, there should be a link in the description of the video. As you can see, the reading for this engine is a very healthy 166 psi, or round about there. The best part was that it only took a couple of pulls to achieve this reading. If you get a reading that's below 90 psi, I'd be a bit worried. It would point to a fair amount of wear in the engine, and if the reading is below 60 psi, it's doubtful the engine would even start. Luckily for us, it means we can try a test start. After putting some fuel into the engine through the spark plug opening and with 2 pulls of the rope, the engine started and ran for a few seconds. Now, since it started and ran, it confirms that the reading for the compression would seem to be good and that we also have a working ignition system. Now, if the engine didn't start, I would then use my spark checker to confirm that we did or didn't have a working ignition system. Next, we'll put some fuel into the tank and try starting it. Unfortunately, the engine didn't do anything. Now, since this fuel system has no purge bulb to help get fuel to the carb, the only way for fuel to get to the carb is by pulling on the rope and having the internal pump work to draw the fuel up from the tank. Now, if it's not working the way it's supposed to, you can cheat by priming it manually with fuel again. Now that it ran for a few seconds with fuel in the tank, it might have been able to draw up some fuel from the tank. Hopefully we'll have a different outcome when we try to start it again. So that pretty much confirms that the carb is not working the way it's supposed to. I know that looked and seemed pretty futile, but unfortunately when you have a single fuel line from the tank to the carb, this is about how frustrating it can be to get it to start, especially when it hasn't started in a long time. So this is basically the same headache you'd face at the beginning of the season after a couple of months of storage. Now, if you live in a warmer climate and use your blower more often, this won't be much of an issue. The first thing we need to do is to get the carb off the engine so we can inspect its condition. I will say one thing about this blower, and that is it's very simple to work on, but it's not at the expense of quality. The only tough part was getting the intake boot off the inlet for the carb, but once I've gotten a few pieces off the engine is when we start to see some of the areas I missed when I first tried to clean it. Now, it's not terrible, but imagine how bad it could have been if I didn't even try and clean it in the first place. I'll of course clean what dirt I do find, that way we keep the contamination down as much as possible. After that, I'm going to take off the pumping section of the carb first. Now, this is the part of the carb that's responsible for pulling fuel from the tank. What I'm looking for is the type of material the pumping diaphragm is made of, and also the condition of the check valve flaps. After taking a look at it, it's difficult to tell anything about it, so we'll need to remove it from the carb for a better look. Now, once off the carb, the diaphragm seems to be a rubberized membrane, which is prone to becoming stiff after time, especially when exposed to ethanol fuel for long periods of time. The other issue are the flaps. Now, they look okay, but if they're petrified, they won't move like they should. Now, this one isn't terrible, so I'm going to say it should be okay to reuse, but I've been wrong before. The next item to check is the inlet screen. We need to make sure it's clear of any debris, which it is. After that, we need to make sure fuel can pass through it, but to do that test, we need to remove the plate covering the metering diaphragm. This would also be a great time to check its condition as well. The same basic rules apply here. We need to make sure the membrane is not petrified and is somewhat flexible. The other issue is we need to watch out for is if it has any wrinkles in it or if it's warped, all of which will affect the way it works. So initially, it would appear that it's showing some signs of hardening, however it might still work, but the bigger issue is that it has a few wrinkles in it and it's also warped. Now, if I had to score this diaphragm, it would be poor, but it's not the worst I've seen. That means it would be best to just replace it. Luckily, I buy these in bulk and keep plenty on hand, so I've already got its replacement ready and waiting. Now, with the diaphragm out of the way, we can now put fuel into the pocket for the screen and press the rocker arm on the other side and see if fuel passes through the screen. And after pressing it, you can see that the fuel passes through it immediately, which is great news. Now, if yours doesn't disappear, you'll need to clean the screen with carb cleaner until the fuel can pass through it. The next item we need to tackle are the fuel adjustment screws. What you're looking at are the limiters that keep you from turning them too much in any one direction. The only issue is that they're not going to allow us to turn them enough to get the machine to work like it should. Now, I've only done this a handful of times before, and it seems like I keep trying a different method each and every time. For this one, I'm going to drill a small hole in between the caps and then thread a small screw into it. This should allow me to remove the outer plate, but unfortunately, I made a mistake and it doesn't quite work out. Now, the metal they used for the plate is extremely weak, and I ended up damaging the threads while installing the screw. That meant when I pulled on it, it simply pulled out the screw. Now, this time I'm going to do the same thing, except this time I'm not going to tighten the screw as much as I did on the first one. Now, after that, I carefully pulled on it, and this time it finally came out. Just to let you know, if you decide to get an aftermarket carb instead, these screws will be fully exposed, and you won't have to do this to them. The next thing I want to do is to figure out how many clockwise turns it takes for it to bottom out. That way I can take them out so I can clean their passages with carb cleaner and then reinstall them the way they came out. This will also give me a good baseline if I ever wanted to know how many turns away from the factory I end up at once I've finished tuning it. Now, I used to not do this, but it seems to work out better if I do it this way. Just make sure you don't lose them or get them swapped, although I'm not even sure if that's possible. Once they're safely out of the way, I'll then carefully spray carb cleaner into their openings in both directions, starting with the interior openings. This will help to ensure that any clogs will leave the carb out through where the screws go in. Now, once that's been done, I'll then reinstall them until they stop. Then I'll turn them back out the number of turns I counted earlier. After that, I'll then install a new metering diaphragm from my stash and then follow that with the metal plate and screws. Now, to be honest, when I order these diaphragms off the internet, I'm only looking at the pictures. I don't typically reference part numbers. All I'm looking at is the length of the stem in the middle of the diaphragm. They basically come in two sizes, either short or long, and this one happens to be the longer version. However, if you don't want to mess with getting just the diaphragm, I just get an aftermarket carb instead. Now, if you need the carb for this particular blower and don't want to deal with this kind of headache, there should be a link in the description for the carb along with a few extra parts. It's unfortunate, but I probably should have taken my own advice, and if you couldn't tell, that was a bit of foreshadowing for what's about to come at the end of the video. After getting the pumping section back on, I'm going to reinstall the carb back onto the engine. Now, I already confirmed that the fuel filter is still connected to the line inside the tank and that the line is not blocked by blowing about 10 psi of compressed air into the line. The other shorter line is a pulse line from the engine to work the pump, and it too is in working condition. Besides, this design is so easy to work on that I can replace them once we know the blower is in working condition. I do have a couple of issues with the design of this blower. Because it's so simple in arrangement, a lot of the components are exposed to be damaged. Now, I'm not complaining too much, but it does mean you have to be a bit more careful when handling and transporting it. That seemed to be the case for the throttle cable's anchor. I was having some issues working the throttle because the cable end was not secured to its anchor. This required some massaging to the metal on the anchor, but of course, this simple design allows the anchor to not only be damaged easily, but also to be fixed easily as well. Surprisingly, because this echo blower was so popular back in the day and they're still around now, you can still get 90% of the parts for it, even the throttle lever and the arm that holds it, which I'm pretty sure was broken quite frequently because of careless handling. That's one of the main reasons why you should buy name brand equipment, which is the increased chance to get parts for it, even if it's not to restore it, but just some mundane part that on a cheaper machine would either be overpriced due to lack of demand, or you may not be able to find it at all. After getting the throttle fixed and replacing the string they're using to keep the choke off, I think it's time to try and start it. So unfortunately, it didn't even try and start. This time I'm going to help and make sure fuel gets to the carb by priming the engine with some fuel through the spark plug opening. After running for a few seconds, there should be plenty of fuel at the carb now, so we'll try and start it again. Yet again, it didn't even try and start. This time I'm going to try it on the ground only because the blower wants to slide off the table as I pull on the rope. Unfortunately, this is not going well at all. Now, I do have an idea of what's happening, but I'm going to give it one more go, and then after that, I may have to try to come up with another plan. So this time I'm going to adjust the fuel adjustment screws. Now since I'm priming it with fuel and it starts but it won't run on its own, I'm going to guess that it wants more fuel, and because I can't tell which screw needs to be turned, I'm going to turn both of them about a quarter turn counterclockwise and then try starting it again. Unfortunately, it didn't start, but I can confirm that it does start when I put fuel into the engine. The only thing I can come up with is that the pumping diaphragm is not working to pull any fuel from the tank. Now, at this point, I can either order a new carb or a carb kit, or I can do one other thing, which is to try and rejuvenate the diaphragm for a day or two and then try starting it again. After taking it out of the carb, you can see that it is wet with fuel, but it doesn't want to seem to get past the diaphragm. What I'm going to do is let it soak for a day or two and then put it back in and try it again. Hopefully it works, otherwise I'll have to try one of the other two methods. It's just a real shame, I kind of wanted to hear it run today. So in the end, we found out that the blower does work and that the carb seems to be the only reason why it's not working. Now, I probably should have just bought the aftermarket carb and called it a day, but it wouldn't be me if I didn't try to at least save a couple of bucks on something. So my question is, if this was your project, would you even waste your time trying to save an old pumping diaphragm, or would you just spend the 20 bucks on a new carb instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.